Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining, whether that's in person here in this room or virtually. I'm Rebecca Yeh. I'm a senior research analyst with the Coalition. As you all know, the Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance Program has really provided an unprecedented amount of funding to stand up a wide variety of emergency rental assistance programs across a diverse set of local housing markets and political contexts. And this has really provided such a unique opportunity for housing research. And so in this session, our panelists will provide insights into the latest research on implementation and impact of ERA programs, as well as discuss implications for policy and future research. Before we begin, I want to just cover a couple of logistics. This is a discussion panel, so we'll use about 40 minutes for discussion, 20 minutes for questions from you all. For those of you joining virtually, you can submit questions through the Q&A function. You've just got to scroll down below the video, and you'll be able to submit some questions there. If you're in this room, just raise your hand and I'll hopefully call on you. There's a really bright light, so if I don't see you, wave a little bit wider. I have a lot of glare on my glasses. And yeah, our wonderful Agile colleagues will come run to you with some mics so that you can ask your questions loud and clear. And then last, I just want to plug, whether you're here in person or virtually, to engage on Twitter using the hashtag EraseProject2022. Without further ado, I am so pleased to introduce the folks here. I've got Claudia Aiken, Director of Housing Initiative at Penn, Andrew Orand, Vice President for Research at the Coalition. I'll try not to grill you too hard, boss. And last but not least, we have Lisa Bates joining us virtually. She's a professor in the Toulon School of Urban Studies and Planning at Portland State University, and you'll notice it's very early in Portland, Oregon, and so I just want to give a super special shout out and thank you for joining us at the crack of dawn. And so let's begin. So Claudia, Andrew, and Lisa, you're all doing really interesting work related to emergency rental assistance, all at different scales with different focuses. I'd like to give you a chance to give a brief introduction on the research you've been working on. Lisa, let's actually start with you and the research that you're doing in Oregon. What have been your main questions of interest? What kinds of outcomes are you looking at? And what have been the most important things you've learned so far?
Sure. Our research out here in Oregon, which is focused on our state, was motivated by our work on evictions, which started before the pandemic. And then, of course, attempting to divert and eliminate the hazard of evictions for tenants during the pandemic became, an enormous priority. And our research is really focused on the experience of tenants, how tenants understand the processes that they're going through, starting with talking with folks in 2020 about their experiences of attempting to navigate the eviction moratorium and some of our local rent emergency funds that were available to them, and recognizing how difficult it really was for people both to get the information that they needed and also to navigate through policy systems, extensive means testing, and sort of needing to call from place to place and getting queues here, there, and everywhere to try to get some of their basic needs met. Oregon then implemented, along with its ORAP, the Oregon Emergency Rental Assistance Program, what they call the Safe Harbor, which was an opportunity for tenants who had applied for rental assistance to request a set over or a rescheduling of a non-payment eviction case to a later time. That safe harbor period extended from starting out about a couple of weeks to 90 days to 9 months, as it became difficult for the state to keep up with rental applications. So essentially, the tenant would receive a non-payment notice, would request a set over of their case while they waited to get their rental assistance. And then hopefully they would get rental assistance and the landlord would dismiss the case. So we've been tracking those cases quite closely. I would say that one of our primary findings is that safe harbor process was pretty rocky for people to navigate. About 1/4 of cases with non-payment eviction cases in Oregon received the safe harbor and eventually were dismissed. In other words, they had applied for rental assistance and we presumed that they got it. About a half of non-payment cases did get dismissed, which is pretty typical here because a large number of those are dismissed through what's called a stipulated agreement. The tenant has negotiated either paying their rent or exiting the property, even though under the program, they would have had the right to stay there until their rental application was cleared or to apply for rental assistance. And many of those folks just didn't make those connections and make that process happen. And probably most distressingly, 1/4 of non-payment eviction cases ended in a default judgment of eviction when the tenant failed to appear in court. That is, probably the dumbest outcome that could happen in those circumstances when we had, hundreds of millions of dollars of rent assistance. But the problem is for tenants is finding out the information, understanding how to both apply a 35-page application with a tremendous amount of documentation they needed to bring to the table, get their landlord to pay attention to that application, but also importantly, and I think this is where our research has been unique because we do a tremendous amount of court observation, is to navigate the special magic words in the courthouse. Exactly what do you say at what moment to get safe harbor to happen, and particularly in a time when most of the courts here were operating by Zoom. It was difficult to sort of run into someone in the room who could help you or support you. There were mutual aid groups sort of unmuting and yelling into the microphones to try to help people to understand that there's a special magic sentence that you have to say. But seeing that and continuing to see that as we are just now coming out of the safe harbor period with cases returning to court after long set overs from January, we're seeing again that tenants are really struggling to navigate, to find eviction legal defense, which Oregon has ramped up massively, but can be difficult to connect to and to navigate through some of the systems without the support of attorneys proves very difficult for tenants.
Thank you for sharing that. Oh, thank you for sharing that. That's really interesting, and I think it's really unique compared to some of the other research that's going on that our panelists are going to be talking about. Claudia, you're doing some site-specific research, and the focus is really different. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. So HIP has been doing a lot of research around ERA, some of which has been at the national level, trying to understand the variation in the design and the implementation of programs. As Jean mentioned earlier, there's been over 500 Treasury ERA programs alone. So I think it's really important to understand what the differences were. We're also working in close partnership with the coalition to do tenant surveys and research to understand the impact of ERA across a bunch of different sites, including Oregon and Northern Ponca, whom you heard from earlier. But I'm going to focus on HIP's very local research, our deep partnerships that we have with a handful of programs, including Atlanta, Baltimore, the city of Oakland, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and the state of California. And I think it's worth noting that California's program at $4 billion in total funding is the largest such program in the country. Not to say that it's representative, but definitely worth studying. So the basic framework that we've had for this research is repeatedly surveying tenants. So the first survey is embedded in the program application when they first apply, and then we follow up at regular intervals. Then with help from our partners, we match tenant surveys with application data provided from the program that tells us about the case status of that tenant. Were they served? How much assistance did they get, if any? What was the timeline for that? And what kind of assistance was it? The hope then is to understand much more about who is applying for ERA, who's getting the help, and what is the impact of receiving ERA on a variety of outcomes. So from the surveys, we learn about things like housing stability, of course, also financial stability, health and well-being, and childcare needs. In some of our partner locations, we're also then matching the survey data to larger administrative data sets or even private data sets to understand more things about credit health, about residential mobility. We want to learn about interactions with the criminal and juvenile justice system, and we want to learn about homelessness. In California, we're also trying to learn about how the outreach worked and how equitable that was through a partnership with Deshnae Dozier. She's a professor at UC Long Beach. And in Oakland, we're planning to work with Jackie Huang at Stanford to actually help the city build on their ERA work to design a post-Treasury ERA rental assistance intervention. So we're just now starting to get early findings from this research. For instance, in California, we're learning from our baseline survey that in the pool of applicants for ERA, 22% of them were a year or more behind on rent. Over half had borrowed money from some other source to try to pay for their rent. And a fifth had experienced within the past year some extreme form of housing instability, whether that's sleeping in a car or living in a motel or sleeping on the street. Then using our follow-up surveys and application data to just do a basic comparison between those who received ERA and those who did not, we see that the assisted group was less behind on rent, that they were far less likely to have experienced homelessness since applying for ERA, and that they were also less likely to report a negative landlord interaction like harassment or a threat of eviction. With our Philadelphia data, our partner Yanhua Li is already kind of a step ahead and has done some rigorous modeling to show that even the early ERA payments, which, as Ayana said, were comparatively modest, were associated with significantly lower rental arrears, lower likelihood of borrowing to pay rent, and lower levels of self-reported debilitating anxiety. I'll just kind of stop there and say, though, that I think it's equally important what we're learning about ERA and what it can't do. It hasn't served everyone. It hasn't erased the deep precarity among extremely low-income renters, which certainly predates the pandemic. In Philadelphia, there's no measurable difference between assisted and non-assisted folks in terms of making decisions to cut back on medical care and food to try to make ends meet, which I think is really indicative that this is not a panacea. It has really important effects, but it's not the silver bullet, and there's a lot more to learn about how much housing instability was actually prevented.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's definitely a theme that we'll probably discuss a little bit more as well. But thank you for sharing that, what you're doing at the site-specific level. And so, Andrew, I'm gonna kind of pass it over to you. Lisa's work is following tenants through the eviction process, and a lot of the site-specific research that HIP is doing is following folks through the emergency rental assistance process. What kind of research have you been up to at the national level?
Yeah, thanks. So since the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of our research has focused on what practices ERA programs have been implementing. So how have they been designed? I just want to mention, we've had a really great team tracking about 1,000 emergency rental assistance programs since the beginning of the pandemic. So Rebecca has been on that team along with Sophie and Neetu and Emma. We've had multiple interns, and they've done a great job in tracking these programs. We started off, even before the CARES Act, trying to identify where states and localities were implementing their own emergency rental assistance programs. Of course, then we started tracking which grantees were using CARES Act funds, and then of course we started tracking what Treasury ERA grantees were doing. And it has been really fascinating to see how changes or programs have evolved over time, and I think we heard quite a bit of that with our first panel today as they ran into challenges and how they have evolved to overcome those challenges. We have, like I mentioned, we spent a lot of our time focusing on how these programs have been designed to try to capture the extent they've been designed to reach the lowest income renters as well as those renters who, are predominantly marginalized many times and have a hard time accessing programs. So if you go to our databases that we maintain online, you can see the programs that have adopted some form of self-attestation, the programs that have adopted some form of direct attendant assistance, categorical eligibility, fact-specific proxy, and we've been tracking that. We've also produced multiple reports, mostly from a national perspective. Some of our reports have focused, just generally what are we seeing across ERA programs in terms of what they're adopting as well as what challenges they have. Our two main sources have been our database as well as surveys we've done of program administrators in partnership with Penn and also with NYU Furman. And we've done 4 surveys over the course of a year and a half during the pandemic to capture how these programs have been changing over time. We've also produced some very component-specific reports. So how have programs implemented fact-specific proxy, for example? Or how have programs given priority to certain populations throughout their process of delivering assistance? And then another example is how have programs adopted direct attendant assistance, recognizing that they are important features. And again, I think the first panel today really highlighted the importance of some of those features. Just quickly, and I know we'll touch on these as the panel goes on, but some of the key takeaways for us, and all of you are familiar with ERA, some of these findings are not going to surprise you at all, but some of the key takeaways for the future, at the federal level, some of the things we need to think about is how are allocations determined and allocation formulas. So in case of ERA, the Treasury ERA funds were allocated based on population size. It did not take into account the number of renters or even the number of low-income renters or cost-burden renters. It was just straight population. Plus, there was a minimum allocation to small states of $200 million for ERA 1 and $152 million for ERA 2. So what that meant is that small states and states with lower rentership rates got a disproportionately high amount of ERA to distribute. And just taking 2 extremes here, of course, I recognize these are extremes, but just to highlight this, Wyoming, for example, the state of Wyoming got about $14,000 per every cost-burden low-income renter in that state versus the state of New York. If you look at all the grantees in New York, they got about $1,700 per every cost-burden low-income renter. Of course, Treasury addressed that through reallocation to some extent, but that's a long process. It's not the most necessarily efficient process. And so for future programs, we need to consider the allocation. The other thing that the first panel mentioned, I thought addressed very well is the importance of clear guidance of what is allowed and what is not allowed. As the first panel highlighted, which I was going to highlight as well, some programs are willing to take risks. Some grantees were willing to take risks, many others were not, unless it was clear from Treasury guidance of what is allowed. And that became a challenge. The first guidance was issued in December or January of 2021. And it really did not allow much in terms of flexibilities and required significant documentation. That was rescinded in February. But then between February and this past summer, I think there were 6 different updates to Treasury guidance. All of course, improvements, but that's a pretty slow process. And then at the state and local level, the importance of adopting some of those flexibilities like self-attestation, like direct attendant assistance and fact-specific proxy for income eligibility. Some of the early research that we've done have shown that programs that have adopted those flexibilities have spent their Treasury ERA funds more quickly than those that have not. And so I think that kind of ends, often there's this debate of speed versus equity, but I think what we're finding is really you could do both at the same time. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Andrew. Were there any challenges that you encountered in your research when you were conducting it?
Oh,
for you, Andrew.
Sorry. Sorry, I thought that was going back to Lisa. Sorry. Yeah, I think two challenges that immediately come to mind. One is ERA programs, a number of them, we learned, offered like self-attestation. And so that was an option that was available to applicants. Or direct attendant assistance was an option for applicants. But that information was not online or on their public-facing documents. And so our database that we maintain is based on what is online in program documents. And last year, from one of our survey, well, last year, we found that about 60, at one point in time, found that about 60% of Treasury grantees offered self-attestation, for example. But we did a survey with Penn, and about 92% of the programs that responded said they allowed self-attestation. Meanwhile, our database said 60%. And at first we thought, well, maybe those programs that are taking these flexibilities are taking this program more seriously and they're more likely to do the survey, right? But then we dug into it further and found that about a third of the programs that responded to our survey and said they allowed self-attestation did not have any acknowledgement of that in their, on their website or in their program documents that we could access. So that really creates two challenges. One, from a research perspective, it makes it challenging when we go, one of the things we want to do in the future is evaluate, to what extent did these features lead to different levels of like equitable distribution, right? But it's hard to know what programs are doing specifically if this information isn't readily available. So from a research perspective, that's a challenge. But also from the tenant perspective, as tenants should, as people are applying to programs, should know how that program is functioning, particularly if you're a tenant, for example, who has a bad relationship with your landlord, for example. If you think, well, my landlord's not going to cooperate, so I'm not going to fill this out, where maybe there's an option that assistance would be available directly to the tenant, but the tenant doesn't know that. So that's one of the challenges. Should I stop?
Well, yeah, I wanted to open it up a little more as well to Lisa and Claudia. Were there any challenges you were experiencing in your research? Any topics that were difficult to broach with your stakeholders or even stakeholders that were difficult to reach?
Go for it, Lisa.
Yeah, I would say there's two significant challenges that are quite different. So the first is that tenants are tired and traumatized. They are tired and they are traumatized. So any research that involves, as we do here, surveys, interviews, focus groups, people from March 2020 to now are struggling very mightily. And so part of our community-based research has been advancing a tenant-centered idea, and I should say that in Oregon, emergency rental assistance was directed, it was a tenant application, not a landlord application that was made, was that there should be equity, of course, but also dignity. People speak a lot about dignity, and so that became really important in our research as well. That we're not re-traumatizing people or simply repeating trauma stories in explaining what's happening for tenants, but focusing on systems and structures. So that's one real challenge in the work. And I would say the second thing is in any evictions research is understanding what actually happens to people in eviction court. I think we have a very flattened understanding of evictions data. It is simply not possible to construct a national database of evictions that actually understands what happens in cases or to people. There is one tremendous variation, not only between states, but county by county. County by county in Oregon, the experience of requesting safe harbor, of documenting that one had applied for rental assistance was tremendously different because of just local context issues, different levels of sort of power and relationships in the court. But also understanding what a case outcome means is very different. So we can look at a case, we can look at a dismissal rate of 45% and say, well, that's great. Almost half of people with a non-payment eviction case was dismissed. But that does not mean that 50% of people with a non-payment eviction case stayed in their home and had actual housing stability, because that masks a large number of people whose cases are dismissed because they moved out or negotiated a settlement which included negotiating a settlement to pay rent directly even when they were eligible for rental assistance. So trying to get beneath the surface of numerical data and understand what is really happening, I would say, is the other challenge for understanding the outcomes of ERA in terms of an eviction diversion program.
Yeah, I'll mention two challenges as well. So one around the application data. I mean, I just said, we'll link survey data to application data, and that makes it sound so easy. But of course, there are restrictions around these data, as there should be. They're confidential information, but those restrictions vary a lot from place to place. It's been much easier in some than others. And the way the programs were run actually changed in real time. So sometimes the way that application data was being recorded changed week to week or month to month, and it's difficult to keep track of, what does this case status mean when that was not a valid case status 2 weeks ago. So that's definitely a challenge we faced. And then I guess building on what Lisa said about, we want to reach tenants. We want to reach the most vulnerable tenants. Those are often those that have borne the most trauma and are also most difficult to reach. They don't have reliable access to a cell phone or to email. So we want to capture their stories, but it's much more difficult in some cases to do that. So the precarity that I talked about earlier is almost certainly an underestimate.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's really, really, really important to keep in mind in terms of considering future research avenues as well as future programs or improving future policies. I think that today's convening is really special because we've got so many kinds of stakeholders to the emergency rental assistance program. They also play roles in a lot of other housing programs and policies. They have a lot of influence over different levers in the in housing programs and policies. And so from your research, are there any recommendations you'd have for these folks here when they're considering improving any programs or creating new programs? Are there any even data considerations they should think about as well, whether that's quantitative or qualitative?
Do you want me to start? I can.
Yeah, you can start.
Okay.
Feel free to start.
Awesome. So yeah, this is a great question. I think one of the most eye-opening things for me in our research has been around the other kinds of debt households are taking on in order to pay their rent. And I just really want policymakers to think about that going forward. And when you're only thinking about back rent or paying forward rent or only making payments to the landlord, those programs cannot address this other kind of debt. I think we need to think more about how do we build in this flexibility so that households can actually make the decisions that help them the most. How do we help them be most strategic? So that's one thing. Another thing I'll mention, though, is that for these emergency programs, it often still took months for applicants to get assistance. In the California statewide program, it was most common for people to wait 3 to 6 months, but there were applicants who waited 6 to 9 months, a year, for something that was supposed to stave off an immediate eviction, right? And I think this speaks to how little infrastructure we've had historically to address this program, how quickly jurisdictions have had to set up solutions. And now that the federal funds are disappearing, the risk of this infrastructure just evaporating once more. So my research and our research, I think, speaks to the need to invest consistently in these kinds of systems.
Are there any recommendations that you'd have, Lisa?
Well, I mean, zooming out from Oregon, because I could make a lot of critique about what has happened here in our program, but I also feel confident in saying that Oregon state government was very well intentioned, and many of the things that it was doing was challenged by capacity. It was challenged by IT capacity in particular. It was challenged by what Andrew was describing as changing guidance and the attempt to be equitable and also meet the means testing requirements. And I guess, my conclusion is let's not do that again. States are not good at doing things, and some of them are actually very ill-intentioned. So it's very difficult for me to feel positive about the idea of, building or continuing a state-by-state infrastructure, knowing, again, many, many people fell through the cracks in Oregon. We don't have a state government that's, taking all the money for people who are in dire poverty and building a volleyball stadium with it. That's not happening here. And, when we have infrastructures that we're able to push cash dollars directly to people's bank accounts during the pandemic as stimulus, when we have national systems of disability payments and other kinds of entitlement programs that people are a part of, when we have many ways to touch people in their finances from the federal level, I think it makes a lot more sense to talk about what that infrastructure looks like and what a program design looks like that treats people equitably across the country.
Andrew, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think just to build a little bit on that. So I think early on, and I think maybe we see this in a number of other programs as well, but early on with ERA, I think there was an assumption that all renters live and operate in the formal housing market. So, everyone's going to have a lease if they need assistance, right? Well, obviously some of these grantees quickly learned that that's not the case. And even if you look at today, I think at programs that adopt various forms of different self-attestation. So if you compare it to self-attestation to income, to hardship, to rent owed, a lease or rent owed is the least accepted form of self-attestation, I believe. So there still is sort of this sort of expectation that renters have some type of formal lease. The question about what to do about someone who is renting a room from a friend, I think for many programs still remains a question. And I think that's a challenge that we need to address. The other thing I'll touch on too, and this kind of gets into some research where we're headed, is we're starting to track programs that have either run out of their ERA funds or are close to running out of the ERA funds, and trying to get a sense of what are they doing. Are they going to try to continue any piece of their program now that their funds are gone or they're close to being gone? And my early impression, is that there does seem to be a desire for programs to continue in some way, but the question becomes how to fund that. Rebecca can correct me if I'm wrong about that because she's leading that, but Nitu is too. So I think there's this desire for programs to continue. We know that programs at the beginning of the pandemic, those that had a pre-existing program got off to a much better start, obviously, than grantees that didn't have a program. Grantees that didn't have a program very quickly caught up. It took them a couple of months, but they pretty much caught up to those who already had a program. But still, it highlights the fact that there needed to be this infrastructure to be developed. We now have it. Grantees want to continue it, and how do they do that? And so that's why we need more resources.
Yeah, I think that those are all really good points around sustaining the program, thinking about who's the right actor and what level. I think that we're going to change gears a little bit because it's starting to get a little later in the day. I'd love to open it up to you all, actually, to ask some questions. Any burning questions, folks? And just as a reminder, if you're joining virtually, you can scroll down below the video and submit a question, and we'll have somebody relay that here. And you can raise a hand. I see a hand over here. And we're actually going to run a mic to you, so just hold on a second.
Thanks.
Can you say your name and then
Sure. I'm Ann Bacon. I'm the CEO at Impact Community Action Partnership, and we administered the program for Polk County in the city of Des Moines. And you said something just a minute ago about self-attestation about rent owed. And since you're researchers, and we all know how challenging some of the guidance has been, one of the challenges we saw was for self-attestation of rent owed by either the landlord or the tenant, we then had to only pay fair market rent, which I don't know about other jurisdictions, but most of our families are paying above fair market rent. And so do you see any way to get around that? Anyone? No?
That's a good question. I mean, the challenge is if I think, and we have seen this in programs that they if there's no documentation of rent owed, then they have to have some limit on what they provide, right?
Yep, there's a 3 month.
And it often is less than what they would provide someone who has that documentation. Whether it's right or whether it's good or not, I mean, fair market rents are kind of they're sort of like a
That's
national
opening
data
a
source that's
whole
around.
new Pandora's box.
Yeah.
It's just why we didn't do it. You
Yeah.
were wondering why we didn't do it.
I think I also I see a couple hands. One over there. It's Chi-Hyun, and I think I see Greg. Is that you? Yeah.
Hi, this is Jihyun Kim from the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. So, Andrew, I was struck by what you spoke about with the disconnect between what program administrators were actually implementing and what information was potentially publicly available to tenants and landlords, because it's also something we saw while we are tracking programs that work in PA. So, because of the discrepancy you saw, I was wondering if you're able to kind of get at the question of whether having that information available actually makes those flexibilities more effective versus them being kind of behind the scenes.
That's another really good question. We have not done that, but I will say, though, that is something that we do plan to start looking at. So one of the questions we haven't, we want to look further into is, I mentioned earlier that we have looked at these program flexibilities and how they have influenced spending. One thing we have not been able to take a close look at yet, because we haven't had the data, is to what extent they have influenced who was served. And data is becoming available that we will be able to, like, program-specific data is going to soon be available where we will be able to do that. And I think it would be interesting to look at this difference between programs that provided that information like readily to the public and those that didn't. Might be a possibility for us to do, but we have not done that.
I also actually want to turn this question to Lisa too, because your work was following tenants through the eviction process and kind of taking a finer tooth comb, trying to see, what did tenants know and what's the gap there and how to facilitate that process better for tenants.
So in terms of knowing about the actual rental assistance program's existence, I think that a large network of community-based organizations and what we call here culturally specific organizations was deployed to try to get the word out. I think that was effective in many cases. Probably underutilized were the school system, the public health information system, which was broadcasting constantly information about COVID, but was not broadcasting constantly information about housing assistance, and the 211 system, which has generally been pretty behind in terms of, people call 211 for various kinds of help and assistance, and it seems a little challenging to update the information in those systems. What we have found is that tenants really struggle with anything that involves a referral to a referral to a referral. If there's a voicemail to be left and a call back to get, if there is a number that leads you to another phone number, that can often be very stymieing, as people were spending hours and hours of time sort of waiting on the phone. Many of the online systems, people actually do have access to online. I mean, we actually really have not found so many people who have absolutely no access to online, particularly because they do have phones. But access to online systems with appropriate translation of language, not so great. And the ability to actually fully complete things online through a phone, a mobile-based browser, was also very challenging for people because some of the materials were lengthy or needed uploads and attachments and things of that sort. So often what we found was there was an information gap, to be sure, but in terms of tenants that we actually reach in our research, the problem was not information. It was getting from information to action and resources.
Claudia, did you want to add anything to that? I know that.
Well, I was just going to add another question to Ji-Hyun's question, which is, I think there are so many aspects of ERA programs where we're still asking what impact did they have, so I can think of a million things that I'd like to know about. I want to know what was the difference in impact between a direct-to-tenant payment and a landlord payment. I want to know if someone got their payment 2 months quicker, what difference did that make? There are a lot of questions, too, I think, around the motivation for programs that are still unanswered. Why did some programs adopt the flexibilities that Treasury offered while others did not? I think there were a lot of barriers that we're just starting to understand, but also, I think there's discrimination and bias that we're also uncovering.
Mm-hmm. And I know that we have several questions out in the audience. Kim, I will go to you and from our virtual audience.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. So first, we have a question from Lauren that touches a little bit on what Claudia was just talking about. Are there data that can tell us whether funds that go directly to tenants versus directly to landlords have better outcomes for housing stability and eviction prevention?
Andrew, do you want it? Andrew, do you want? Or Claudia, do you want to answer that?
I mean, yeah. So there are programs that have done both. So that's kind of a natural experiment. Where we can compare those two groups, hopefully, through survey data, also in terms of application data, how quickly were they served, and then trying to understand, were they ultimately evicted or not. So I think we're getting there. It's definitely possible, and we're maybe on the verge.
That was going to be my answer, too. Working on it.
Okay. I see some hands in the far back. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. My name is Julia Orduña, Texas Housers. And Claudia, you spoke a little bit about other forms of debt. And I was wondering if any of y'all had anything to speak about that. And that's the narrative that we see and understand, that if we made a significantly smaller payment, maybe for the car, then they'd be able to go to work, to get the check, to pay rent. Was that anything that you all heard in your research? And is that something that maybe some of these programs should be thinking about or implementing instead?
Yes, thank you for that question. So in our surveys, we've asked, how did you borrow? And a lot of people, of course, say, I borrowed from friends and family. But other folks have said, I went out and got a payday loan. And the interest rate on that, is insane. So thinking about how we can avoid that kind of borrowing specifically, I think, is really important. And when you've got the direct-to-tenant assistance, you also have more risk. There's a chance of fraud. People don't trust tenants to do the right thing with that money, but you have so much more flexibility. There's so much more opportunity for tenants to be strategic. Yeah.
Oh, Kim, back to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. So we have another question from Scott. Our experience has been that only about 65% of tenants in a low-income apartment complex who are eligible for ERAP actually ended up submitting an application. Many tenants were simply non-responsive. Is there any evidence that explains why 35% of tenants don't apply or respond to inquiries?
Oh, I think Lisa. Oh.
So again, yeah, my research is pretty much exclusively working with low-income tenants and asking them these very questions. People are frightened, and when they get things in the mail that they don't know what they're about and they look like they might be a scam, they don't reply to them. I cannot stress enough, again, that people who are low-income tenants who are balancing all the different kinds of things that Claudia in the previous question were asking about, not just their rental payment, but trying to address jobs, schooling, transportation, getting a piece of mail, getting something taped to the door. There was like a whole effort to bring things to people's doors. The same thing that you get an eviction notice taped to your door is now telling you about rent assistance. People were being targeted by all kinds of predatory, payday, check into cash type loan scams. Just getting information, particularly if it was written at with a bureaucratic style, a kind of language that is not everyday language, came from agencies with which they were totally unfamiliar, because we know the vast majority of low-income tenants do not get any kind of housing assistance. So getting something from a housing agency that's not someone they have a pre-existing relationship with, was just really difficult. And in our work, we've been really pushing and saying, if running rental housing is a business, and address business people with their business problem. Expecting tenants to navigate through these complicated systems on their own repeatedly is absolutely a way for people to fall through the cracks and not really understand that there is help for them.
And I'll just add one little piece to that. It also, this would of course depend on the area where the person asking the question is from, but early on, maybe this is still true today, but early on we ran into programs that the documentation requirements in the application were really long. And we were contacted by at least one of those programs wondering, why aren't people applying? Why are they starting the application process and not completing it? Well, it's like a 50-page application asking for all the documentation up front. Like, it seems like that might be why people aren't completing the application. So I think that also influences whether people complete the process. So what does your application look like? What are you asking for up front? The example I just gave is actually from a program that was funded with CARES Act funds, and they were using multiple funds. And to decide which source of funds they would use to provide assistance to that person, they asked that person for documentation that would fit them into which program. Well, that's a lot of potential documentation. So that was a problem. That's an extreme example, but so I think they have to look at the application process as well.
And I'll just add one last piece. There's a great study out of the People Lab that looked at something as simple as sending out a flyer with your normal bureaucratic language, like Lisa talked about, versus a flyer that destigmatizes ERA, that says, we know you're struggling, everyone's struggling, you deserve assistance. And that made a huge difference in uptake. They found that it made a huge and measurable difference.
Lisa, I think that you were trying to say something, and something that I'd like to. Oh yeah, go. Something.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other piece is like not to. Documentation is difficult for people to acquire and often like technologically submit, because it's you needed a picture of this or a certain kind of file and the file size. That was one whole layer of things. But also, sometimes people are doing things to survive that are not completely above board, and then they are frightened. So when we, work with folks here who are working under the table, who have off-lease occupants, who are, undocumented, et cetera. And if if you're talking about a low-income apartment complex, there will absolutely be people who are operating in a gray market economy, who do not want to submit documentation in those ways, or who have other, and this is an enormous barrier here for people receiving eviction legal services, that their primary goal is to stay out of and far away from any legal court system, whether because of previous criminal charges, immigration pending charges, or just other kinds of fear, that they would prefer not to become perceived by those systems as much as possible.
Yeah, and something that I'd also like to kind of add and ask on that, building on all of this, is are there any other recommendations you'd make around communication strategies that seemed more effective in your research? Claudia, I know you already mentioned one. I know that as researchers, it's easy to kind of become critical and really delve into that, but kind of on the flip side, are there any recommendations or strategies that you saw that were more effective?
I would say absolutely the warm handshake and, concierge from a trusted community partner, particularly one that is, again, culturally specific, not just in language access, but across a wide variety of life circumstances, that people might want to have a sort of person, or a person who understands the experience that they're going through, to support them, not only to give a referral, but actually the organizations that were able to help folks with, doing applications together over Zoom, having small computer lab type of clinics, et cetera. But again, I would ask the question of why. There's a lot of efforts that one could make to speak to tenants more effectively. I would flip the question and ask, perhaps we should be talking to the owner and operator of rental housing about how they can access funds appropriate to maintaining their business operations. We do know in Oregon that a number of multifamily companies got PPP grants, we'll call them now, since they're not going to pay them back. And so, watching that process, seeing the possibility of having direct to landlord compensation funds, and then putting a lot of effort into figuring out how do you bring along tenants, how do you, communicate differently or slightly tweak means testing for tenants. We could be asking a very different question here about who should be jumping through hoops, submitting documents, or sort of proving up their claims.
I know that I want to move on to a final question, but I just wanted to see if either of you had anything to add to that.
I mean, Lisa, what you just said made me think of when we were talking to the administrators of Seattle's program, and they said that some of the most effective strategies they've had around increasing uptake of vulnerable tenants has been bulk enrollment through institutional landlords. And I think you can get a lot of bang for your buck that way.
Okay, so I have my final question is really about what kinds of research questions remain. What would we benefit from having more research on? Do you want to go first,
I'll
Andrew?
go first. So there's a couple of things that come to mind. I think the immediate question that comes to mind is, for lack of being able to phrase it better, who benefits the most from emergency rental assistance? I mean, emergency rental assistance is important for many households, but what we're starting to see is that as programs are running out of funds, they are retargeting who they're using their final funds to serve. And I think there's a question in that is sort of, if you're retargeting your funds because you're running out, who benefits the most from those funds? I think is a useful question to ask. Somewhat related to that is, what goes through my head is what happens to households after their emergency rental assistance runs out in the intermediate term and long term. And I think particularly in terms of the extremely low income renter, if that renter was struggling before the pandemic, wound up in even a greater crisis now, they receive assistance, but that assistance is for, maybe at most a year, or up to 15 months, but probably not that long. What happens then? And I mention that because, we're starting to talk about evaluations in terms of the intermediate outcome and the long-term outcome, but emergency rental assistance is for a crisis, temporary, short-term situation. And we can't, we can't see that as a solution to some structural problems we have. And so what happens to those renters? Have we delayed, basically we delayed a bad outcome, which is good, for a while, especially if you're in the middle of a pandemic, but it'll probably wind up showing this cannot replace our need for long-term assistance.
Lisa, do you want to chime in? Do you have any thoughts on what kinds of research questions remain, and what do we need future research to do in emergency rental assistance related programs and eviction related programs?
Sure. Well, I think that the body of research that's emerging around sort of landlord types and business practices of different ownership structures is very important for understanding kind of who the most problematic actors are in the housing market and thinking about what regulations could be addressed there. I think the other piece that as I said before, the variation that exists in eviction court is really important. I think that for especially policy drafters and policy researchers to understand more about the on-the-ground implementation and actual procedural activities that emerge from these ideas that we have in our minds. As a policy thinking person, not a legal thinking person, simply ask for a delay to your eviction case while you wait for your assistance seems very straightforward, but the way that that's actually carried out in terms of instructions, from the state judicial department to circuit court judges, to the way that that gets expressed in a courtroom, to, the responses by landlord attorneys, there's a lot more that happens on the ground, and thinking more carefully about how, the complication of those systems and the variation in those systems needs to be understood, I think, more effectively, to think about how we craft policy and law around eviction diversion.
I think I've already mentioned one of my major questions, which is about how different program features influenced the impact and also the equity of these programs. Program administrators spoke earlier about, we didn't do first come, first served. We used a prioritization model, but we don't know yet. I don't think we know what impact that has had, and that's a really important question, and there's 100 more questions like that. I think another thing I'm very curious about, and I think will be useful to know, is why were some jurisdictions really poised to make the most of ERA, to go beyond fear of federal audits, to take risks. Why were some in that place and why were some not? And what can we do to rectify that going forward?
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Claudia, Lisa, Andrew, for this fabulous panel. I know we could go on and on about the research on this, but the audience is saved by lunch. There's a buffet outside this room. Lunch is an hour. You have an hour to nourish yourselves, mingle, what have you. So please, if you're returning to the room, you can return at 12:30. Otherwise, enjoy.